The night stretched endlessly across the plains, painted in silver light from a lonely moon. The cowboy rode, with the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves striking the dry earth, each thud echoing into the silence. A cold wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and sage. It was the kind of night where every sound felt louder than it should, where the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the corner of your vision. The cowboy wasn't running from anything, at least not tonight. He was just a man moving forward because stopping meant remembering. His wide, brimmed hat shielded his eyes from the glare of the moon, but his instincts stayed sharp. Out here, the wilderness was alive, and danger often wore silence as its mask. He kept one hand near the revolver at his hip, not out of fear, but habit. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries cutting across the stillness. The cowboy gave them no mind. He knew animals weren't what he needed to fear. Not these days. The horse suddenly slowed, its ears flicking forward, nostrils flaring at something unseen. The cowboy pulled lightly on the reins, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. That's when he noticed a shape slumped against the dirt road. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags left behind by travelers. But as the horse drew closer, the outline became unmistakable. It wasn't cloth. It was a body. He stopped a few feet away, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he dismounted. The cowboy's gaze lingered on the figure, still and half, hidden in shadow. There was no sound but the faint whisper of the wind and the restless shifting of his horse behind him. A sense of unease settled in his chest, a whisper telling him that what he was about to discover would change the course of his night. And maybe more. He approached slowly, every step deliberate, the weight of silence pressing heavy. The pale glow of the moon slid across the figure, revealing torn fabric, dark stains, and skin too pale for comfort. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew one thing for certain. No one ended up like this by accident. Something had happened here, and whatever it wasn't over. Up close, the figure wasn't just still. It was fragile, broken, as if the desert itself had tried to swallow her whole. The cowboy crouched low, his gloved hand brushing the dust from her face. The moonlight revealed streaks of dried blood across her cheek, her lips cracked and trembling with shallow breaths. She wasn't unconscious, but she hovered close to it, drifting between pain and fear. When her eyes fluttered open, they were wild and glassy, as though every sound in the night carried the threat of death. Her voice came suddenly, weak but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Just make it quick. The cowboy froze at her words. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. But the desperate look in her eyes told him she wasn't begging for water or mercy. She was expecting the end. She thought he was one of the men who had done this. The words weren't just spoken. They were resigned, like a prayer she'd already repeated too many times. The cowboy leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. She flinched, her body tensing as if bracing for another blow. Her dress was torn at the shoulders, dirt ground into the fabric, and deep cuts ran across her arms and collarbone. Each wound looked deliberate, not the work of chance or accident. Whoever had left her here hadn't wanted her dead. Not yet. They wanted her to suffer. The cowboy's stomach churned, his hand tightening around the handle of his revolver. Still, he didn't move in anger. He moved slow, deliberate, like handling a wounded animal that might bolt. "Miss," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "I ain't the man you think I am." His words carried no promise, only truth, and he waited to see if she'd believe them. Her eyes narrowed, studying him through the haze of exhaustion and blood loss. For a flicker of a moment, her breathing eased. But fear didn't leave her face. She had been hunted too long to trust easily. The cowboy tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and pressed it against her worst wound. She gasped, weak fingers grabbing at his arm, but she didn't push him away. Her eyes shifted again, this time darting over his shoulder. Scanning the darkness behind him, the cowboy understood that look. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of whoever was still out there. And from the way her gaze lingered on the horizon, he knew they weren't far. The cowboy stayed on one knee, his hat tipped low as the woman's shallow breaths rattled against the quiet night. He could feel the heat of her blood soaking through the cloth he had pressed against her wound, and it made his jaw tighten. He had seen plenty of violence in his time, but something about this wasn't the same as bar fights or cattle rustlers. This was cruelty, slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to harm her. They had wanted to send a message. He spoke low, his voice steady like stone. "Miss, whoever did this to you, they'll pay." The words weren't shouted or sworn in anger. They came out calm, with the kind of certainty only a man like him could deliver. His eyes, sharp under the shadow of his hat, locked on hers. For a moment, she searched his face, looking for a lie, a crack in his resolve. But there was nothing. The cowboy didn't deal in promises he couldn't keep. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came out at first. Her hands, weak and trembling, clutched at his sleeve. The touch wasn't a plea for comfort. It was desperation. She wanted him to understand something bigger than her wounds, something that made her eyes dart nervously into the darkness again. The cowboy followed her gaze, but saw only swaying grass and shifting shadows. Yet he knew better than to trust what he saw. He tightened the makeshift bandage, tying it off against her arm. She winced, her body shuddering from the pain, but she didn't fight him. Her trust was fragile, but it was forming, slowly, hesitantly. The cowboy pulled his revolver free, the metal glinting under the pale moonlight. He scanned the horizon, his posture unshaken, a silent wall between her and the unknown that stalked them. "Whoever you're afraid of," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the dark ridges in the distance. "They're gonna find out what it means to pick the wrong fight." His hand never wavered on the gun, and his voice carried no mercy. To the wounded woman at his feet, it wasn't just a vow. It was the beginning of a reckoning. As the cowboy adjusted the bandage, his eyes caught something strange on her skin, something that wasn't just a wound. Along her forearm, beneath the torn fabric and dried blood, was a mark burned deep into the flesh. It wasn't the kind of injury made by a knife or whip. It was a brand. The edges were jagged, raw, as though pressed into her with fire until it scarred permanent. He brushed away the dust clinging to it, and the full shape came into focus, a circle split through with 3 savage slashes. The sight of it made his chest tighten. He had seen symbols before, gang marks, cattle brands, warning signs carved into fence posts. But this one stirred something darker. It wasn't for identification. It was for terror. Whoever carried this mark wasn't just claiming land or livestock. They were leaving a calling card on human flesh. The cowboy stared at it a long while, the firelight of his memory flickering with an image he wished he could forget. He had seen that very sign once before, seared into the hide of slaughtered cattle left to rot in the sun. He remembered the stench, the flies, the silence of a ranch stripped of life. Back then, the sheriff had called it an act of vandalism. But the cowboy knew better. It had been a warning, an unspoken message meant to spread fear across the land. And now, here it was again, etched into the arm of a woman who had barely escaped with her life. This wasn't random violence. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and it was spreading. The woman noticed the way his hand lingered over the brand, and her breathing quickened. Her lips parted, trembling as though she wanted to speak but feared what would come out. Finally, in a whisper that sounded more like confession than explanation, she murmured, "Don't let them see it. If they know I lived, they'll come back." Her eyes were wide, shimmering with dread, as if the mark itself carried a curse. The cowboy pulled his hand back slowly, his face unreadable in the moonlight. He tugged her sleeve down to cover the scarred flesh, his movements careful, precise. He didn't say anything right away, but the promise he had made moments earlier grew heavier in his chest. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. This was about the men who carried that mark, and what they had started on these plains. Her breathing grew uneven, her voice breaking as she forced words past the pain. At first, they came out disjointed, fragments that barely held meaning. Family taken, black coats desert. The cowboy leaned closer, straining to catch every syllable. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, as though each gust of wind might carry the men she spoke of back to finish what they started. She wasn't simply injured. She was hunted, and even in her weakened state, she knew the chase wasn't over. She finally steadied herself enough to speak a little clearer. Her voice was low, a ragged whisper, but it carried a weight heavier than a gunshot. She told him of riders cloaked in long black coats, their faces hidden beneath wide hats. They had come without warning, tearing through her homestead like a storm. They weren't thieves. They didn't want money, or cattle, or even land. They wanted people. They had taken her kin, every last one, dragging them into the desert's darkness with ropes and laughter that still rang in her ears. The cowboy's expression hardened with every word. He had heard of men like this before, stories swapped over whiskey in saloons, whispers that most folks dismissed as drunken tall tales. But this woman's scars were proof enough. Her trembling wasn't from fever. It was from memory. She spoke of the way they marked their captives, of the ritual cruelty they inflicted, and how escape was never meant to happen. Her survival wasn't luck. It was defiance. And defiance was something men like that never forgave. Her gaze fixed on the cowboy then, her eyes shimmering with both desperation and warning. "You don't understand," she rasped. "They don't stop. Once they've taken someone, they always come back." Her words trailed off into a broken sob, and for the first time, the cowboy felt the enormity of what she carried. This wasn't just an attack on a single family. It was a pattern, a trail of shadows creeping across the frontier, swallowing lives as it moved. The cowboy's jaw set like stone, his fingers brushing against the grip of his revolver as though weighing his choices. He didn't say anything yet, didn't offer comfort or doubt. He simply stared out into the vast stretch of desert night, listening to the wind whistle through the sagebrush. Somewhere out there, beyond the silence, men in black coats were still riding. And from the way the woman's voice had broken, he knew the night wasn't finished with them yet. The cowboy had just finished tightening the reins when his horse gave a sharp snort, ears flicking back. It wasn't nervous. It was warning. He froze, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his side. The woman clutched his sleeve with trembling fingers, her eyes wide as they darted toward the ridgeline above. She didn't need to speak. He already felt it too. They weren't alone. At first, it was only a ripple of movement, shadows bending against the pale wash of moonlight. Then he saw it clear silhouettes shifting atop the ridge, long coats brushing the ground, the glint of steel catching the starlight. Whoever they weren't hiding anymore. They wanted to be seen. The cowboy's jaw tightened, his pulse steady but heavy in his chest. These weren't coyotes prowling for scraps. These were men, and they were hunting. The silence shattered with a single shot. A bullet whistled past his hat, tearing the brim clean through before embedding in the dirt behind him. The horse reared with a sharp cry, nearly throwing them both. Dust filled the air, the woman gasping as she clung to the saddle horn. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, hauled her onto the horse with one swift motion, and swung into the saddle himself in less than a heartbeat. Instinct had taken over. He had been under fire before, and he knew hesitation was death. Another shot rang out, then another. Sparks burst from the rocks beside them as the ridge lit with muzzle flashes. The cowboy bent low over the horse's neck, spurring it hard. The animal lunged forward, hooves pounding against the dirt as it carried them into the darkness. Behind them, the gunfire echoed, each shot chasing their heels but missing by inches. The woman buried her face against his chest, her cries lost in the thunder of hooves and the whip of the wind. The plains opened wide ahead, a black sea of grass under the endless night. But even as they rode, the cowboy knew escape wasn't simple. The men in black coats weren't firing to kill. Not yet. They were driving him, forcing him into the open, the way hunters corral prey before the final strike. And as the sound of horses echoed faintly behind them, the cowboy understood a truth he didn't speak aloud. The hunt had only just begun. Hours later, the plains had fallen quiet again. The cowboy had led the horse deep into a stretch of broken land where jagged rocks and twisted mesquite trees offered cover from prying eyes. A small fire burned low, its glow barely enough to chase away the night. The woman sat wrapped in his coat, her body trembling less now, but her eyes still haunted, darting at every sound beyond the firelight. She hadn't spoken much since the chase. Fear hung over her like a shadow that refused to lift. The cowboy crouched by the flames, his revolver resting on his knee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't fooled by the silence. Out there in the dark, men in black coats could be waiting, circling like wolves. His hand brushed the edge of his holster now, and then a reminder that he was ready if the quiet shattered again. Still, he didn't let her see the worry etched into his features. To her, he had to be steady, a wall no storm could break. At last, her voice broke the stillness, fragile and raw. "You don't know what you're up against," she whispered, staring into the flames. "They're not like other men. They don't feel fear, they don't stop, and they don't forgive. Once they've marked you." her words trailed off, her throat tightening, as though she couldn't bring herself to finish. The cowboy studied her quietly, the firelight dancing in his eyes, and waited. He didn't push. He let her words hang heavy in the night air, knowing that silence often carried more truth than questions. She turned to him then, her face pale and streaked with dirt, but her eyes, though filled with terror, still held a spark of defiance. "You should leave me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "If you stay, they'll come for you too. They'll never stop. Not until—" She broke off, shaking her head as if the thought itself was too dangerous to speak. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she seemed smaller, more fragile than before. The cowboy leaned forward, his voice a low rumble beneath the crackle of the fire. "Darlin'," he said, steady and unflinching. "I don't need to know what they are. I gave you my word." His eyes didn't waver, his hand still resting on the grip of his revolver. "And I don't break my word." The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark, and in that brief glow the promise in his gaze burned hotter than the flames. Whatever hunted them out there, the cowboy had just drawn a line, and he was daring the darkness to cross it. The woman fell silent, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet still wide with fear. The cowboy sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if daring the night itself to bring what it carried. Somewhere beyond the veil of silence, horses shifted, their distant echoes swallowed by the wind. He didn't know when they would come, or how many, but he knew it didn't matter. With a steady hand, he adjusted the revolver on his knee and pulled his coat tighter around the woman's shoulders. Above them, the stars burned cold and endless, as if bearing witness to the oath he had made. His voice, calm and low, cut through the stillness. "They think they're hunters, but by the time this is over, they'll learn what it means to be prey." And with that, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as the promise of blood and vengeance lingered beneath the endless sky.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.